The St. Mary the Virgin Production Studio presents the 5th edition of the series titled Ministering to the Whole. This week's presenter will be no other than Brother Irwin-Errol Gregory, radio personality, educator, economist, and a dear friend and member of the St. Mary's family. The title of this week's presentation is Effective Financial Planning During the Pandemic Period. Errol will be sharing with us some of the basics of budgeting, investment tips, and money management, as he likes to say. So come along, join, and enjoy the moment together as we learn from each other through our risen Savior, Jesus Christ. Have a holy and blessed week.
Gentlemen, I am Errol Gregory, and I want to thank the church committee for this opportunity to do a presentation on financial wholeness during the current crisis. And I also want to look at, emergency funds, budgeting, debt financing, and then the one that's most challenging, to take a look at what I'm calling strategic investing in the current crisis. So let's look at. We're starting with where we are now, what you are familiar with, the current crisis. And a good description of it I found is one that says it came from out of nowhere. So much so that within a space of 3 weeks, the Jamaican stock market indices moved from where it was at, say, the end of March to below the previous year's levels. And the Planning Institute of Jamaica, PIOJ, has already said that the tourism sector is expected to record the most severe contraction in activities during the April to June quarter. And it has actually said that the country will lose US 995 million. So we know how far the crisis is. But let's start our focus on how do we manage our financial wealth or our financial health in this kind of environment. The first thing I'm suggesting is that we need to have an emergency fund. And this is regarded as critical whether we're in a COVID crisis or not. That just generally, as part of planning for our future, and given that there are certain unforeseen circumstances that we always would have to deal with, that we want to start with an emergency fund. And this emergency fund is to be kept in a liquid form because it's not an investment. And the rule of thumb regarding the emergency fund is that we should have a minimum of 3, and now they're saying even as much as 6, though we know that for many persons 3 months salary is really a tall order. But you understand the philosophy behind this is saving for the rainy day. And so we're suggesting, as I said earlier, we keep this in a liquid form, maybe linked to ABM card, so that were you to get a call in the middle of the night that someone is ill, one of your family members, at least you could respond appropriately. And of course, the benefit of this emergency fund really would show up in the current crisis, as so many people are saying that they were caught off guard and they don't have any savings or nothing like that. So that we are suggesting that this is a good habit to get into to ensure some level of financial wellness. And in fact, I'm suggesting that you want to keep this money maybe in a savings account in a commercial bank. And this is the only time you're going to be hearing me talking about savings in any kind of commercial bank account, because presently the rate of return that you're getting on your saving is less than the inflation rate. So inflation is eating up what you're even getting when you keep the money in your savings account in the bank. And then the next issue, of course, is what I'm calling the value of budgeting. So you have your emergency fund put aside. Well, your next issue is to deal with the importance of budgeting. We can't escape this. And the budget, as you know, is a written document showing your expenses and your expected income sources. But we think it must be written. We don't think that you should say, as we're told that some men tend to say, oh, I do this so often, I don't have to write it down. No, this is a written document to guide you along for you to take a look at what is your main expense item and also where the spending is going, and is it being spent on what we call discretionary items or essentially necessities. And we know the warning to avoid impulse spending on items, of course, that you never budgeted for. And we know that when carefully, it is a tool that allows you to live within your means. And, done properly, it helps to create, even if it's little, an extra amount that you can really use to spend on what is you regard as, your priority item. Now, there is normally a suggestion that you should live below your means in order to achieve your SMART goals. But a new or a novel idea where this is concerned is that you should live instead below your means. And I found this a little frightening at first. But what you're doing here is trying to create some surplus for, down the road. So living below your means may just mean that you may not have as many cables, many options on your cable, or you may have to drive an old second-hand car, which you normally would not have. But it's just the idea that if you give yourself some surplus, then you would be in a better position, certainly in the short to medium term. So that is something to consider, the value of budget. And another issue that we all grapple with, and the COVID-19 will be no protection against having to deal with this issue, is the matter of debt financing. Should we borrow money at all? Now, in this regard, we identify what we call good debt versus bad debt. And good debt, as you know, refers to instances where we borrow money to acquire assets that will ultimately generate income. So maybe the most popular example of this is when you take out a mortgage and you borrow money because you know that the house that you buy is generally appreciating almost every day. And I remember when I was thinking of making that move, one of my friends told me, he said, at the start when you have to pay that mortgage, sometimes you won't know where your lunch money is coming from. But once you stick to the payment, you would feel justified over time. As for one, the amount that you pay being fixed will become less and less as a portion of your earnings. And most important though, that over time, that asset will increase almost exponentially. As you know, many persons in Jamaica can give you stories of the price that they paid for their houses and the value it now generates. And in this regard, when we're talking about debt financing, one area that's controversial that we should maybe try and avoid as much as we can, though I'm not seeing it as a taboo at all, is to manage your credit card. And the philosophy about managing your credit card is that what you want to do is to be in a position that when the bill comes, you can pay off all that is on it at the end of the month, or the end of the whatever is the payment date. because you don't want to be in a position where you are, either late for payment or worse ever, to be trying to just make the minimum payment. Because, persons have said that if you keep paying just the minimum payment, almost as if you're going to be trapped, and that's a serious word, for a very long time. So have one is a tool, but make sure that when you get that bill, you're in a position to pay it down totally, that the bank won't earn any interest off you. And in this regard about borrowing money, I want to make just a little plug for credit unions generally, especially for young persons who are just starting out. And young persons are in the phase that we call the acquisitive phase. That is to say, they now want to exert their independence, and a part of that, if they're living at home still, or of course if they've moved out, it doesn't matter, is to acquire things for themselves. So they need a flat screen TV, they need the music system, and they need a microwave, whatever, or the expensive laptop. So because you're gonna be acquiring things, it's good to have a philosophy about how you're going to fund your expenditure. And the normal, and as I say, at that stage, we normally say a credit union is a good part of that mix. And part of the argument is that credit unions are owned by their members, and that interest is calculated on the reducing balance, which means, as you know, that as you pay down your debt, the amount that you have to pay, gets less and less. And another aspect of why we like the credit union is that their philosophy is, if you borrow money, even if you borrow on your own money, they ask you, how much would you be willing to add to your savings while you pay down the loan? So that is something that's particularly, regarded as a great asset to why you should join the credit union. And, in a practical way, rather than opting for hire purchase, which, as we know, I would never be, running any negative, saying anything unnecessarily negative about hire purchase, because we know for many persons that's what facilitates it and facilitates a lot of their purchases. But we're saying, if you could borrow the money from your credit union and just pay for it one time, rather than having to pay to make those, onerous, sometimes high purchase payments. But that's something to consider, especially for the younger. NCB has said that the COVID-19 has made it experience a hit of some 190 billion in that second quarter. Having said that, we know that the central bank recently reduced the cash ratio that commercial banks have to respect. And what that really means is that there's more liquidity in the banking system. On top of that, we have heard that the central bank has asked the commercial banks, financial institutions, not to make the usual dividend payouts that they used to make. So what that means, those things cumulatively mean that the banks are stronger in terms of liquidity, and one can, of course, anticipate that, in a very short time, because the banks have such strong balance sheets generally and are heavily capitalized, that they will soon return to a positive position in the near, and that listed equity funds. Now, what are we talking about? And we have had at least two examples from Sagicor, and I don't work for Sagicor, I'm just using them as an example. What this instrument does is it combines a number of top securities. If we use Sagicor's select fund, as they call it, financial, what they do is they invest in, say, 10 of the most profitable financial institutions. And what they do is they invest, and what they try to do is they want to outperform the index that the Jamaica Stock Exchange uses to say how its financial shares are performing. So let's do that slowly. The say this Sagicor Select Fund Financial, it wants to prove that it is outperforming whatever the Jamaica Stock Exchange has as its index that it puts out of the major financial institutions that trade on the stock exchange. And when the Sagicor Select Fund came out first, the units were sold at $1 per share. And remember that I'm admitting that initially the stocks went down in terms of the financial, but remember we're saying the manufacturing and distribution, those units have gone up. And with the select funds, and I'm not so sure if NCB now has one that's similar to Sagicor's, but any equity funds that's listed means that you can trade with them. And the funds suggest some that what you have is a collective of small amounts that are put together to then invest in an instrument that will give returns to the to the small investor. So this is regarded as the kind of instrument that will still be able to withstand the volatilities occasioned by COVID-19. Okay, so it's not as if the market is totally closed for especially the perceptive investor who still wants to look for opportunities within the market, because most of us just kind of say it loosely sometimes that behind every crisis we know there is an opportunity. Now I want to say something about foreign currency. In the current crisis, given the fallout from the tourism sector, we have had utterances from the BOJ governor suggesting that the fluctuations in the dollar will continue for some time. He did say, of course, that the bank will use some of their reserves to smooth out flows. But what is certain is that for some period there will be fluctuations in the Jamaica value in relation to the US dollar. So many persons may opt to enter unit trust arrangements or that would put the money in some global fund, or or some persons may just want to save in US dollars because they know the likelihood of gaining as the Jamaican dollar loses value in relation to its US counterpart. Now the problem with that is that the central bank is not likely to just sit idly by when this happens. The central bank is likely to want to sometimes just intervene to shock the market and reverse that process of the dollar sliding and creating what we call an appreciation of the dollar, which means if you were speculating that in 2 months the value would move from 148 to 152, just to quote some figures, then that simply would not happen. Because the central bank, remember now, still wants to ensure that the value of the dollar, even though it is market driven, is consistent with other objectives which the government has. So, in summary, How do we maintain our financial health in this COVID-19 period? What I'm suggesting is that, firstly, whether there's a crisis or not, there's certain principles that hold to be true. And those principles are the need for the emergency fund, the value of a budget, and for your having some philosophy about how you use borrowed money. And then I'm also saying, maybe for the younger persons, that the unit trust remains an attractive instrument, even in a quote unquote trying time like this. And I'm saying further that there are opportunities related to listed equity funds. And I'm saying there's one company that offers two of these, one in the financial sector, one that has to do with the manufacturing and distributive sector. And I'm saying that even though the crisis is on, the perceptive investor should continue to look behind the scenes, as it were, to see what companies have been able to take advantage of our changed demand in this crisis. Those companies we have said are those in the manufacturing and distributive sector. And what I'm saying also is that, we're all kind of shell shocked because of the coronavirus, but where our financial health is concerned, that we still have to try to be on top of it as much as we can. And I want to thank you for allowing me this presentation. Thanks again.